Well, this morning we're going to continue with our series, The Jewish Background of the Bible, Part 10, with Dr. Merkin. And, sir, if you want to just come forward, you may proceed.
Sure. I was listening this morning to something about the War of Attrition, 1969. Israelis were fighting Russians, and they kept it secret for decades. There's a lot of information coming out now. I was reading a book about, we get our Freedom of Information Act. Well, they get something similar in Israel, and they're getting more ideas of how the nation was founded, like 1948, 1949, what the leaders were really saying in their meetings. So we'll bring that out, but this morning it was just, wow. But I knew down in 1973, I think they'd shot down Cuban and maybe North Korean pilots. I guess the thing is the communists say, oh, it's an easy win, go ahead, get some practice. Almost like sending your second string or something. And it's amazing what Israel's had to face. I want to show you a few books. I have more time today because I don't have to run out to work second shift. This, which is hard to see because I'm not supposed to take this off, Intra-Library Loan. I am rereading this. It is fantastic. Life on an Israeli Kibbutz. You can go to our library here in Oak Ridge and order it from another library. They'll track it down. They've done it to me a couple of times, for me a couple of times. It's also used on Amazon. And if you're at all interested in sociology, what happens when kids are raised communally? What happens when you go to a place where they take all your clothes and you share everything? Read this. It's very interesting what it does to the human psyche. And I'm not saying it's all bad or it's all good. But it's not a long read, but it has got a lot of interesting stuff in it. Here's another one. I mentioned this book last week. I did see 2 copies in the library. The others got like a softer cover. And this lady died in Oak Ridge not too long ago. The librarian who helped me find this, because they had rearranged some books, said he saw her. I think he went in with a school group or something. They had her vet her, he said. She died in her 90s. I like The Diary of Anne Frank, which is a very famous book. This is much better in a sense because there's so much more information. Anne Frank is hiding and talking about her feelings. This lady's gone from camp to camp talking about what really happened there in these different camps. It's a really good book.
Who's the author on that?
The author, Myra Richke, whatever, however you pronounce that, Kimmelman. A lot of these people are from Poland and stuff, and I don't know how to pronounce these names. Myra.
Oh, M-I-R-A.
Yeah. Myra, R-Y-C-J-K-E. So, yeah, Kimmelman, she got married. Here's another one, kind of like Anne Frank's diary. They actually found this hasn't been out that long. They found the diary. They're still finding stuff over there. And again, I don't know how to pronounce that. I'll just call it Rauka's diary. R-Y-W-K-A. It's from the Lotz Ghetto, which they pronounce like Vuch. I've heard it pronounced that way. Found at Auschwitz in 1945 and published 70 years later. This is from our library. Another one, which I read from another library but found here, The Myth of Hitler's Pope. It talks about Pius XII and how he was instrumental in shutting down Father Coughlin, that pro-Nazi guy in the radio in Chicago that was giving our president the fits too, Roosevelt, FDR. But he said, they called him Hitler's Pope, but he actually did a lot for the Jews. He was telling monasteries, hide the Jews. He apparently, Coughlin said, people aren't listening to me anymore, so he got off the airs right after a talk with the Pope. The Pope met with Roosevelt. This is on page 57, by the way. But it clears up a lot. But that's on page 57 where they talk about Pacelli, which was his name, and Father Coughlin. Pacelli visited in 1938. He wasn't Pope yet. But anyway, the anti-Semitic radio priest, Father Charles Coughlin, he's very famous. You can hear a recording of him at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. So he met with President Roosevelt, and soon after, they managed to get Father Coughlin silenced. Coughlin admitted that he'd been silenced. When Pacelli visited America, he had conversations with our highest government officials, which conversations could be regarded as a type of informal pact. Coughlin wrote in a 1954 letter, so that was long after that. Small as I was, it was necessary to silence my voice. He was, by the way, Pius XI, from another book, was also Philo-Semitic. There was a circular, I think they call it, that was about to be published, but then Pius XI died, and it's still in the Vatican archives. But a pro-Nazi Jesuit named Lito Chowsky, or whoever in the world they pronounced that, and intercepted it. I think he had an American, I think Pius XI had an American that was writing something, to protect the Jew, very Philo-Semitic. This one was new when I first arrived in Oak Ridge 3.5 years ago, or soon after that. This is from our library, The Chosen Wars. Now this has nothing to do with combat, how Judaism became an American religion. And it's got a lot about the development of Judaism here, including the first Jews that came from Brazil. The first Jews in the U.S., which they might have been some in Columbus. Columbus might have been Jewish, there might have been some in Columbus's boat, but Columbus never really got up here anyway. But there was a boatload of Jews from Brazil, Sephardic Jews. This one I happened to find in the same section. I haven't read it. The Girls of Room 28. Friendship, Hope, and Survival in Theresienstadt, I guess they call it. Anyway, it's one of those Holocaust books. I've read that the Library of Congress has 16,000 Holocaust books on record, and this is one of them. And I just glanced through it. I don't know if I'll ever have time to read it. I'm rereading the Kibbutz book because it's very relevant for what we will be talking about, especially in the last presentation. But these are good books, interesting books. They're all available from our local library, except this one you'll have to get it through interlibrary loan. And there are others. There's all this World War II Holocaust books, stuff like that. Now, we're going to look at Jewish background of the Bible, part 10 out of 13. Modern Jewish history up to the birth of Israel. Orthodox Judaism. Now, I know you won't confuse this with Orthodoxy, which is sometimes called Eastern Orthodoxy. There's Roman Catholicism. Well, Catholicism is split into Western and Eastern, something most Protestants hardly know anything about, because we're very Western-centered in our thoughts. But that's different. That's Eastern Orthodoxy. I can think of 3 churches in this area that are Eastern Orthodox, by the way. Yeah, because I've been to one. It's the Orthodox Judaism. It was the only form of Judaism that there was at one time. So they didn't even call it Orthodox. That was Judaism. Until the Reformed came along. Okay, until Reformed Judaism came along, it was the only type of Judaism there was. So Jews were all Orthodox at one time, and the term wasn't even used. It's a term coined, Orthodox Judaism was a term coined by liberal Reformed Jews with a sense of opprobrium or derision. In other words, they're Orthodox. Now, I grew up Reformed, did go to conservative Hebrew school for a couple of years, and there is not the same difference that there used to be. Reform started out very secular, very anti-religious. They did not wear yarmulkes. These days, I've heard they do. We didn't. It was very radical when it started, and like a lot of radical movements, it kind of finds a center ground later on.
Are these the ones that wear the black, the long, when we went to Israel?
Some of them are the ultra-Orthodox, and I'll have a slide on those. That's ultra-Orthodox. Orthodox, let me think. It was all the Jews at one time until 1810. Okay, when Reformed Judaism really was given birth. The people you're talking about are the Hasidim, New York, Williamsburg, New York, I think 300,000 of them, they are ultra-Orthodox. My father's side of the family was Orthodox, but my grandfather used to daven every morning and put on the tefillin and pray. But they were not ultra Orthodox. They didn't wear yarmulkes. I mean, at least on the street. It's kind of like Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform, but it's actually diversified since I was a kid. We'll look at that. Remember, this is not Reformed, but Reform. Reformed theology is that Calvinistic stuff came out of the Reformation. Reform Judaism. Reform, my mother told me, is because we keep reforming, which Reformed Christianity pretends to do, but they don't really do much. Reforming. This is what you're talking about. Hasidim, more often spelled with an H. Now here's the problem: when you get into the Bible and you get into just writings, the H and the H sound, okay, are usually transliterated. In other words, put in our alphabet with an H, even though it's often a CH. So when you read something in the Bible, how do they pronounce it? You have to look in the Hebrew Bible. Or maybe Greek, but especially the Hebrew Bible for those terms, because you don't know. The CH, there's a type of CH which is also often written with an H. Well, I mentioned that, like Noah, the guy with the ship here, Noach. But Noah, one of the 5 daughters of Zelophehad, you run into him in Numbers 26 or 27, then it comes out again in Numbers 36 about female inheritance. It's spelled the exact same in English, but it's different in Hebrew. When you really see these CH and stuff, you have to look at what it was in the original Hebrew. They're Hasidim, also often called just Hasidic, They actually pronounce, the ones in New York are going to be Yiddish speaking as their native language. That's where most of the native Yiddish speakers are these days. In Europe, there were several languages that Jews spoke, that they kind of, Hebrew combined with this, combined with that, and Yiddish was probably the most commonly spoken in like the Rhineland. But there were some others, Ladino out in Spain, which is Judeo-Spanish. Yiddish is Judeo-German. It's a combination of medieval German and Hebrew with Hebrew script, some Russian and Polish words thrown in, with Slavic syntax. They are going to pray using the Ashkenazi pronunciation of Hebrew, which they do not speak in Israel, but it's used for prayer in people that are these days that are not native Hebrew speakers. When I was a kid and we went to Hebrew school, we learned the Ashkenazi pronunciation. Then my parents, who were both Sunday school teachers, not Hebrew school in the afternoons because of work, they told me that it was going to change. And they mentioned the changes in pronunciation. We're not going to the Sephardic pronunciation, which we did in Hebrew school. It's probably happened all over the country. The idea was the Sephardic pronunciation is what they speak in Israel. It's just a few letters pronounced differently. Exact same alphabet. It's just hard. It's like British English and, American English. A tube. When we call a tube, they call a tube. We call ethyl in chemistry, an ethyl group is an ethyl group if you're from New Zealand. I had a New Zealand office mate when I did my postdoc. She gave a presentation. It's just pronunciation. But they're even a little different than the typical Ashkenazi pronunciation. Instead of saying O, sometimes they'll say oi. Like instead of boker tov for good morning, boker tov. I actually have a guy at the prison that I speak Hebrew with. He's black. He speaks some Swahili. He was brought up Jewish. I guess he had Jewish and black ancestors and stuff. And he said, he goes to me, boker tov. But I've also heard him singing on YouTube. And we talked yesterday. One of the inmates in the annex where they're free to run around. They don't get locked up. Very interesting talking to him. But this is, now you think, why do they dress like that? Well, anytime you have a group, I met Amish yesterday at Walmart. I asked the guy why I didn't have a mustache, which I had read online. I just wanted to get the facts right. He didn't even know. I think it had to do, as I'm reading, I don't want to say it because it's going to be, in case I'm wrong, but I read online why they don't have mustaches. But, why do they wear these different clothes? Because when a group starts at a certain time, the dress code kind of freezes in time. Priests and a lot of pastors and stuff, they'll wear, the black with a little white collar, whatever they call that. It's because like in Luther's time, that's what people wore. That was typical dress. And so that came from Poland in the 1700s. 1700s it started in Poland. And we'll look more about that. But some survivors of the Holocaust came here and started these dynasties. They have huge birth rates, like 13, 14 kids. If you ever see the movie, get on, I think it's Netflix, Unorthodox. Maybe not. Because I can't stand when they have homosexuality in movies. That part of the movie was supposedly all made up anyway. What happened in Berlin, they made up. But it starts with a lady that really did leave the Orthodox movement. Of course, Hollywood just changes things. But I have actually heard recordings she's made and other stuff people have said. You can get online and follow the controversy. She says that they don't really know. Well, her problem was that she married a guy and it's like she's married for a year, she's a virgin. The guy couldn't do it, I guess. Well, she finally got pregnant, but I was listening to something on YouTube by a lady there. He says, yeah, the kids talk. She was Hasidic. The kids talk about it. They know, the facts of life. And other people have responded, well, if we're so bad at that, how come we have 13 or 14 kids? It's just that they handle some of that stuff differently. But yeah, the whole Berlin part I've read, it was just, they made that up. And then they knew she had a gay mother in Berlin and she went to Berlin. She kind of escaped the Orthodox movement, or the Hasidic movement. It really wasn't as dramatic an escape as they show, I guess, in the movie. But anyway, that's what they wear and that's where their clothes come from. Now the earlocks, called peyot, or if you use the Ashkenazi pronunciation, payas. That's, thou shalt not round the corners of thy beard. Here's how the Hasidic movement started. Now I'm not going too fast. Last week I had to talk fast and make it to my shift. Thou shalt not trim round the corners of thy beard, that command in the Bible. So they let from even as kids, to let this grow. Now I needed it, my first time in Israel, I kind of needed a haircut, and someone thought I was starting to grow earlocks. I just hadn't had a haircut in a while. I wasn't bald back then. And yeah, that's the reason. Thou shalt not mar the corners of thy beard, however that is. So they let these grow. The Baal Shem Tov, that wasn't his real name. That's what they call him, master of the good name. He was Israel ben Eliezer, born in Poland. He did not live all that long, about 62 years. 1698 to 1716. He was orphaned when he was 5 years old. He did not hold an official position. They taught him Kabbalah. Now, Kabbalah I've never really been interested in. It's just there. It's the Jewish mysticism. I remember from a Hebrew school book, the Kabbalists would draw magic circles in the sand and the Messiah's coming, whatever. They use Hebrew letters, which can stand for numbers, and here's why the Messiah's coming next year. Christians do it all the time. I have survived so many second advents or raptures in my lifetime. My first book I wrote, I listed them all. And I'm serious, a bunch of books. 1975 was spelled Rosh Hashanah. 1975, Jesus was supposed to rapture people. On and on, 88 or 81 and 88 and 80, I think 89, on and on it goes. So we do the same stupid thing. But anyway, there was a new emphasis on Jewish tradition. See, Jews love to study. Okay? I left college when I got saved. I don't recommend that for anybody. It's how God led me. Bible school and mission teams, and Bible school at least was somewhat, well, it wasn't really academic. It was mission training. It was very good discipleship, very good training in some ways, but there's nothing academic about it. And I just couldn't get away. I went back to college at age 30, lived in a dorm. My mother said, what are you going to live in a dorm with a bunch of 18-year-olds? I said, well, it's better than working with McDonald's with a bunch of 18-year-olds, which is what I was doing. Well, some of them were older, but My first roommate was 40, so I don't, you know. That was in Alaska, which is a very educated state, by the way. Okay, it really is. Now, the idea was that Jews are studying, and the Baal Shem Tov was saying, let's get joy back into it. He wasn't saying don't study at all, but let's get joy, let's get emotional, or however you want to put it. The joy wasn't there. It was just very academic, pedantic. They read. Jews have read the Torah. Well, the whole Old Testament, but especially the 5 books of Moses, the Torah. And Torah sometimes can mean the whole Old Testament, which is really the Tanakh, which I mentioned last week. Torah, Nevi'im, is prophets, and Ketuvim is writings. They order the books differently. It's same books. But he wanted more joy in things. And it picked up in popularity. It focuses on the heart, not just the mind. Joy, prayer. They came up with it. Tzaddik, the righteous Jew, the leader of his sect. If you can ever pick up The Chosen, okay? There's a book, which I did not read, but I've seen the DVD time and time again, okay? The Chosen, because it's about 2 boys. This is World War II. 2 boys in New York. One is the son of a Hasidic Rebbe. The top leader is called not a rabbi, but a Rebbe, R-E-B-B-E. And it's a dynasty. It goes on to the kid and the next person. It's very interesting, not at all dirty, unlike today's movies. And another boy, and they meet at a baseball game, and I won't ruin it for you. There's one part where I show my chemistry students when I was teaching chemistry, this is why you wear goggles. And if you've seen the movie, you know why. The mitnagdim, that means people against something. That was the opposite. Okay? Vilna Gaon is the guy. Really, they often give names to these people, like the Baal Shem Tov. It was Elijah ben, or Eliyahu would be in Hebrew, ben Shlomo Zalman Kaimer. 1720 to 1797, he was a leader of Lithuanian Jewry. He was into the mind. Study, be a scholar. He started excommunicating the Hasidim. He managed to keep the Hasidic movement out of Lithuania. So it never really took good root in Lithuania. It might have been a little bit of it.
Why was he trying to do that?
He was more of the tradition. See, believe it or not, the Hasidic Jews were into something new. They were saying, the Baal Shem Tov was saying, let's get joy in life. They dance a lot and everything. You go on YouTube, see them singing and dancing. And this guy was like, we like the old ways. You study. You see that. It's like churches do that. We'll argue about worship styles and dress codes and everything else. It was that type of thing. But he, Vilna Gaon, wanted people to stick to the older practice of what we now call Orthodox Judaism. All there was Orthodox. You study. You become a scholar. Now you look at the Hasidim, well, they're scholars. What's happened is the 2 groups are kind of closer together, the 2 viewpoints. It wasn't that the Hasidim were rejecting study. Williamsburg, New York today, one of the issues is their native language is Yiddish. The kids grow up and some of them complain, we didn't learn English well enough in our school. Because it's Yiddish and then they read Torah and Talmud and Hebrew and in Aramaic. And, it takes them 4 languages to get through a day. They have to learn English, which includes English, history, I think math and all that. I've got an article at home, 1975, August, National Geographic. It's not the cover article, so like on page 275 or so, called The Pious Ones, because that's what Hasidim means. Hasidim was also used, early in the Hasmonean era, way, way back. I think the Pharisees probably descended from them. But there was that division, and there was the idea that we have to get more joy in our lives. It can't just be a bunch of study. And in Williamsburg, New York today, yeah, they study a lot, but they also sing and stuff like that. But it's controversial. What it is their school system might, they send their kids to private schools, Hasidic run schools, And it might not be the best, but they vote. So if you're a politician and you say your schools aren't good enough, think you're going to get elected again if you try to make a change? Christianity learned that in the 1970s. We got political power. Homeschooling was generally not even legal, probably in a lot of places. Christian schooling, pastors going to jail, whatever. Or at least the threat, you don't send your kid to school or something, we're coming after them. Christians stood up and started, the laws got changed. How are you going to put pressure on a school system to say you're teaching them religion, that you're not teaching them stuff they're going to use in real life, including English? How can you stand up to that and still keep office? Mitnagdim kept the Hasidic movement out of Lithuania. Again, there's more overlap now between the Hasidim and the Mitnagdim, the opposers. It's Judaism today, Orthodox, it's really a combination of the two. The Hasidic Jews, they'll study a lot, but they'll also dance and sing. Again, it was Orthodox back then, but they didn't call it that. This happens in religion sometimes. Again, with Reform Judaism, it started out very radical. Early Israel was socialist, communist. I mentioned my kibbutz in Israel that I was at my second time. There, May Day comes around, they fly the Israeli flag and the red flag of Marxism. The kibbutz I'm reading about it originally, you joined and all your clothes became community property. You own nothing. Some of the more radical ones, they didn't want you to own anything. Now when I was there, it wasn't as radical, and of course now it's more like a covenanted community. I have my house, I have my car, I have my job. Most of the kibbutzim are like that, and the ones that are socialistic have other enterprises so they can afford to be socialistic. Because socialism can kind of drain you financially. We'll talk more in the last presentation about that. But again, a lot of things start very radical and they go more towards the center. The kibbutz movement, Israel itself with its socialism, its anti-religion. Zionism, it started out very anti-religious for most people. In fact, a lot of the Hasidim today, they'll say, we do not basically recognize the state of Israel. The Messiah has to do this. So in Israel, when they have the sirens blow for Israel, I think it's Israeli Independence Day, and everyone stands still, they'll just go about. If you ever get on Netflix and watch Shtisel, there's a day the planes are going to fly overhead, and Shtisel tells his students in his religious school, no, you're not going to watch it. You're not going to go outside and watch it. There's a lot of resentment. I'll get into this in presentation 13. As Israel becomes increasingly religious, the ultra-Orthodox get they get tax breaks, they don't have to go in the military necessarily, on, and it's building up more and more resentment. The modern cause of resentment. Okay, Memorial Day, Yom HaZikaron. This year, it goes by the Hebrew calendar. It's the evening of Monday, April 24th in 2023 to the evening, remember Jewish holidays start at sundown.
Right.
To the evening of Tuesday, April 25th, ends at sunset. It's immediately what they go is they got Independence Day, which they celebrate according to the Hebrew calendar. See, our calendar, it's May 14th, 1948, but they go by the Hebrew calendar.
Right.
That's why holidays in Judaism, they move around just a little bit. Hanukkah, I remember one year was like late November.
Wow.
Now it's very because they call it a lunar calendar. It's not really a lunar calendar. It's a luni-solar calendar. True lunar calendar is what the Muslims use. That's why Ramadan, I think, can occur any time of the year. But it's corrected. They got leap years, so they put a whole month in. And it's not every 4 years either. It's more complicated. But because they celebrate their Independence Day according to the religious calendar, the luni-solar calendar, they also have Memorial Day just the day before Independence Day. In other words, let's recognize soldiers that have died for this independence and died since then in wars. Maybe even people killed in attacks, stuff like that. So you've got Memorial Day, and then the very next day, we're really starting in the evening, of course, is Independence Day. So it's the 5th day of Iyar in the Hebrew calendar, the anniversary of the day on which Israeli independence was proclaimed. Remember, David Ben-Gurion went and read the Declaration of Independence in Tel Aviv, and a bunch of Arab armies started invading. So by our calendar, the Gregorian calendar, it's May 14th, 1948. Here's what happens. You get Memorial Day, Yom HaZikaron, the day before Independence Day. It starts with a siren at 8 in the evening. So when you hear the siren, the Israeli citizens stop what they're doing. They stand firm. I mean, all over the country, they'll get out of their cars. They stop the cars.
Wow.
Okay? 1 minute siren sounds at 8 p.m. and a 2-minute siren sounds at 11 a.m. on the next day, which is the same day in Jewish calendar. Okay? Now, there's also a siren on Holocaust Memorial Day, which this year was Friday, January 27th, which, by the way, that one is set. That's kind of an international holiday. Okay? People stop what they're doing, even if you're driving, and stand at attention. So where's the resentment? The ultra-Orthodox don't like it. That's what it looks like. Now, this is Memorial Day. See, they'll even get out of their cars. And Holocaust Remembrance Day happens also. Now, here's where the resentment comes from. The Orthodox just go about their business like nothing's going on. They don't stop for the siren. Some of them. I mean, some of them, I assume, do. And their thing is the Messiah is going to bring this country into being. We can't do it. The Zionists are doing it, and it should be the Messiah. And so it helps build up resentment between these two groups of people. The average Israeli, and now it's about 25%, the religious, the Orthodox. By the way, they also might not stop for Holocaust Remembrance Day because they've got their own Holocaust Remembrance Day, which I think started way before the modern one. But I don't think that builds up too much resentment because if they want to celebrate their own Holocaust Day or whatever, that's fine. But it's the fact that here's Israel giving them tax breaks, protection, etc., and they don't even stand to honor the fallen soldiers.
So it's resentment on part of the 75%.
Yeah.
Well, why don't they just say to the 25%, if you don't really like it here, why don't you go find someplace else to live?
Okay, that's a good question. Now, who's been telling the Jews, get out, for decades and decades?
The Palestinians, the
Right.
Arab world.
The Arab world's been telling you, you don't belong here. Very unusual, I think, for a Jew to tell another Jew, you don't like it, get out of here.
Not
It's
get
like-
out, just give them an invitation. If you don't
Yeah.
like it here, find some other lovely place to live. If this is too much of a problem for you, to honor us and participate in the IDF and all the rest of that. I would invite them to go try somewhere else. Oh, you already did. How did it work out for you?
Here's what's happening. The Orthodox have a huge birth rate, so they're becoming a bigger part of the population, a bigger proportion of the population. Okay, that's more votes in a multi-party system. They're getting more and more political power. They got the Knesset with 120 people. They got that out of Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay, and you got this thing where you got a vote, and let's say a party gets 10% of the votes, so they're going to have 10% of the seats, and those first. Well, that would be 12 people out of 120, on the list. I get the votes and get the seats in the Knesset. And
Are they participating in that?
but the Orthodox?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, they're in the
Well, I don't
government.
understand. If they don't recognize the state, then why are they participating in the state government? That's a hypocrisy.
Oh, there's plenty of hypocrisy. No, I get to love it when pastors say money doesn't matter, and then well, why are you taking the offering?
Yeah.
Okay. There's a lot of. I realize they got Druze, they got Muslims, Arabs that are in the Knesset. Okay, that as minority parties. Here's the thing. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, that's a good question. If those are part of that, I don't think the entire 25% says we shouldn't have, the Messiah has to do it. It's probably a good portion of them. That would be a good statistic to try to look up.
Yeah.
No, I know. And the Israelis, look, when I was there, 1979. I read in the paper, the Orthodox don't like you driving on the Sabbath. So what do you do on the Sabbath? You go to the beach in Tel Aviv or something, okay? So people are driving by the Orthodox neighborhoods. And the Orthodox they're not peace-loving people all the time. They'll throw stones at your car. At a time when cars were very, very expensive there. I'm sure they still are. Israel's very expensive now. But in the day when you go to Uncle Mustache's in Jerusalem and buy a steak dinner for $1, they're stoning cars. So they had a confrontation with 1,000 versus 2,000. In other words, secular Jews and Orthodox. And I don't remember which was 1,000 and which was 2,000. But it was 1,000 on one side, 2,000 on another. And I guess that they resolved it by agreeing to build a wall. You know how we get those like sound abatement walls by, if you get a highway and then you get a subdivision and people are sick of hearing the trucks roll by. Okay, it was something like that. But it's a problem, and it's getting to be a bigger problem as the Orthodox, because of a high birth rate, gain more and more political power because everybody votes. Yeah, I know some of the secular Israelis probably think like that. You don't like it, leave.
Well, they take away their vote if they don't want to be participants of the state.
Oh, come on, they get Arabs in the Knesset. That's, By the way, the reason Israel did not annex the West Bank in 1967 and still doesn't know what to do was because the Arabs have a high birth rate. The Jews stood to be a minority in their own country if they annexed it. That's the big problem. They administer the West Bank. Well, what's that mean? It's like, we're not going to have you as full citizens maybe, but we're still going to rule you. And that's a difficult situation. It's been going on since 1967. Anyway, here are some definitions. And on part 13, when I talk about modern Israel, I'll get into this a little deeper. The Haredi, they're ultra-Orthodox. Plural is Haredim. Okay? Whenever you see an I am in the Bible, think plural. Or OTH, think plural. Usually the I am is for masculine, which is the majority of nouns. OTH is feminine. Not always. Lila is night, and it's masculine. Leilot, and they don't have a TH pronunciation, it's just T, is plural. It's so, sometimes it doesn't work like that, but more often than that it does. So it helps you when you see the Bible. BATH is daughter or daughter of. BETH, Bethlehem is house of. There's just certain things that keep showing up in these names and everything. Now, the Hasidic Jews, or the Hasidim, they're a subset of the Haredi. I was trying to make one of those Venn diagrams, or Euler diagrams, and it wouldn't let you. It's kind of like when you have one thing and you put another thing over it, it eclipses it completely. Or you can take little arcs, and I just didn't have the patience. Okay? They're a subset of Haredi. They learn from a Rebbe. Notice it doesn't say rabbi, it's Rebbe. They're more emotional. They still, because of the Baal Shem Tov, get into, joy and singing. You get on YouTube, you can see them singing. They'll just break out, like New York, just start singing. Mitnagdim, they used yeshivas, or yeshiva would be, this is what's difficult about Hebrew. They usually accent the last syllable. So when you're taking a Hebrew word into English, it really messes up your speech. Well, we'll say yeshiva, but yeshiva in modern Israeli Hebrew. It's a religious academy, a learning center. You study what they call Torah and Talmud. You study, well, probably the whole Old Testament, especially the 5 books of Moses and the Talmud. And that's where you see hundreds of guys in a room, and some of them going like this, and they're looking at all these books and everything. They use it. Actually, the Hasidim use them now, but at least in the past, that was really the Mitnagdim. They probably came up with the yeshiva idea. Reform Judaism started in Germany in 1810. Notice it's reformed, not reformed. There is Reformed theology, Lutheranism, Calvinism. Moses Mendelssohn was its grandfather, and he was also the grandfather of composers Felix Mendelssohn and Fanny Mendelssohn.
Wow.
Eastern Europe was a place for the Hasidim and the Mitnagdim. What about 19th century Western Europe? Okay, remember Germany is Western Europe.
Yeah.
Well, Reform Judaism had conversion as a way into society. Well, actually, it wasn't really Reform Judaism. That was just a way into society. Convert, become a Christian, no big deal. They didn't have the kind of racism now that the Nazis came up with and everything. That was based on Darwinism. Racist anti-Semitism did not exist until Darwin. Probably. I've never heard of it, as I've read book after book after book about all this. There's never a type of, or really a racial anti-Semitism. I mean, Haman wanted to wipe out the Jews, but basically the way it's founded these days, you know, the Jews are genetically inferior, blah, blah, blah. I mean, the Nazis said, like, Southern and Eastern Europeans are genetically inferior, Northern and Western Europeans are genetically superior. Even they had this stuff taught in the United States, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
They had phrenology, look at a person's brain. You know, you might be able to tell criminology at one time, which is why people commit crimes. Which now you really get into criminal justice. If you want to major in that in college, you might take a course. You have to take a course in criminology. They look at brains and stuff like that. What was that movement that was? I forget what it was called. In the Galton, I think, was one of the guys involved. In the United States, about the 1920s, they were teaching all this racial theory. Okay, I think there was a name. I forget the name for that type of thing, but this was taught. Eugenics. That was it.
Yeah.
Eugenics. Eugenics. Back in those days, you just converted. So over 30% of the Jews in Germany, and this is, remember, way before Hitler, converted. So Reform Judaism started in 1810 in Germany. Many Jews wanted to show their nationalism. It started out as almost a secular form of Judaism. I mean, Israel today, we are a secular Jewish state. And to some people, that's an oxymoron.
Right.
And when you really think about it, well, if you're secular, that means religion's got nothing to do with it. Well, what it is there, it's pretty much a live and let live mentality politically, at least it's supposed to be. Now, with the religious Jews gaining more and more power and trying to have the whole country keep religious law, it's becoming more of an issue. But originally it started out as a secular Jewish state, it still is. But they removed nationalistic notion of the Jewish nation. In other words, we're not going to go back to Israel and build a temple. That's why they started calling the synagogues the temple. See, here's our temple right here. We're loyal to you, my fellow Germans or fellow anybody else, fellow Americans. We're not going to try to go back to Israel and build a temple again. We're here. We're part of your country. We want full-fledged citizenship. We're loyal to you. We're not a complete separate entity with loyalties over in the Middle East. And they started praying in native languages instead of Hebrew. Now, when I was a kid, our prayer books in the synagogue, you get Hebrew on one side, English on the other, and you often go back and forth. That's one of the reasons they send you to Hebrew school, so you can actually learn to read the Hebrew. But, by the way, Catholics said the same thing. You know, they're praying in Latin, and it's like, who understands it?
Right.
You know, maybe we should start masses in English or something. So they've gone through that type of thing, too. Or even like the Maronite Christians over in Lebanon, you know? Well, we can have the same liturgy, we're faithful to the Pope, but we're going to pray in Arabic. So this happens all over the place. So started praying in native languages instead of Hebrew. The services were modeled after Protestant services. A whole lot of what we do in churches, by the way, is really came, I mean, there's a long history to it. But if you ever look at the typical church with the pulpit and everything, where did that ever come from? It's kind of interesting when you look into its history.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you where it came from.
Yeah. But Amsterdam's got a famous synagogue, and the bema, which is what they call the pulpit, don't call it a pulpit, man, that's offensive to a Jew, it's the bema, is in the middle. It's not in the front, it's in the middle. I can remember my parents, when I was in second grade and living in Holland with them for 3.5 months, I was in Amsterdam. I remember them having me pray, probably in English. And I think there was that synagogue. I've seen pictures of it since then, with the beam in the middle. It's a famous one in Amsterdam. But anyway, they modeled the services after the Protestant services. And of course they use the word temple. And it changed after that. You know, Reform Judaism later became pro-Israel, especially in the U.S. But it started out, hey, we're not pro-Israel. Of course, it wasn't in Israel, so to speak. There have always been Jews living there. The last 2,000 years, there have always been Jewish communities there, but a small minority.
Right.
And they were saying, no, we're not trying to go back and build a temple. Later on, Reform Judaism became more mainstream in a sense, and became more pro-Israel, especially here. Now, Moses Mendelssohn believed that religion should be rational. He never publicly rejected the Torah or oral tradition. Oral tradition, by the way, is written in that 6,000-page Talmud. But 4 of his 6 kids converted to Christianity.
Wow.
The second big name in Reform Judaism was Abraham Geiger. He rejected the Bible and the Talmud as divine works. So the idea is the Talmud was oral tradition written down after the destruction of the Second Temple, but they'll justify it that when God gave the law to Moses on Mount Sinai, he also gave them an oral law, which was passed down orally. Now that's not true. But you will notice, even in Christianity, generally people say we're going back to the beginning. Roman Catholics, this is what Jesus established. Eastern Orthodox, this is what Jesus established. Reformation, this is the original doctrine Jesus and Paul taught. On and on. Most people like to try to trace their beliefs back to the beginning. And so the Talmud, they'll even say, well, this is what God told Moses or whoever up there orally to be passed down. And, you know, and they get into all these legends. They start mixing the legend in with the Bible. And anyway, Reform and Orthodox were the only 2 denominations in the USA back then. Reform movement was anti-Zionist. Then conservative Judaism was in between, you know, his Reform to the left, Orthodox to the right. Conservative Judaism started out as more of a middle-of-the-road approach. In 1886, they opened up the Jewish Theological Seminary, or JTS, in New York City. A year later, they had its first class of 10 students in a synagogue in New York City.
Wow.
So now you get 3 branches. But that's not good enough. It's got to be like the church, right? Ever splitting. Reconstructionist Judaism broke away from Reform Judaism. That was Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan at JTS. He started the Reconstructionist Judaism in 1968. Probably all of us were alive then, most of them. Okay, so this is more like within my lifetime. Judaism was a civilization, according to Kaplan. He wasn't into divine revelation. And it was a hybrid between Reform and Conservative Judaism. And there was no moral basis for keeping the laws under Reconstructionist Judaism. What it is, of course, they're getting away from the sacrifice. You know, the sacrifices. We haven't had those in 2,000 years. Even though the Samaritans still have a group that sacrifices on Mount Gerizim. You can see a picture of that in National Geographic. They still do. Mount Gerizim, they still do. I think my pastor witnessed that. He was over there. But they don't have a temple. I mean, John Hyrcanus I destroyed the Samaritan temple. 2nd century BC. But anyway, Judaism got more and more into, obviously the temple's gone. So the Talmud basically says, here's how to keep Judaism without a temple, without sacrifices. But at least Judaism was divine revelation, both written and oral. And then they're getting away from it more and more to where it's like more liberal, like, it's the morals that count. Sounds kind of like a liberal Christian church. Theodor Herzl and Zionism. Some Jews wanted to go back to Israel. They saw Judaism as a religion and not a nation. Okay? Now, 1894 in France was the Dreyfus Affair. I've talked about that. When a French military officer was accused of treason, imprisoned on Devil's Island, and it turned out he was the fall guy for what someone else did, and they were able to get him out of prison. And he served in World War I. But it had really brought the world's attention, the attention of the world to just how much anti-Semitism there really was. Because it's, people in France were split over it. He did not live long, 1860 to 1904. He was born in Hungary. Later, the family moved to Vienna. Remember the old Austro-Hungarian Empire and stuff? You can't always separate the two completely. That's what he looks like, famous picture. He didn't like religion. He was a journalist in Vienna. He covered the Dreyfus affair as a correspondent in Paris. When this thing's going on, he goes to Paris, and he's the reporter. So that probably changed his mind. He had actually considered conversion to Christianity. He wrote a play called The New Ghetto. Also, in 1896, he wrote The Judenstaat, the Jewish state. So he became the father of modern Zionism. Now, other people have been thinking about that too. In 1897, he convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. The assimilated Jews in Munich didn't want it in their home city. They were so assimilated, we don't want to go back to Israel. So you're not going to have it in our city, so he had to do it in Basel. Okay? He was elected president of the Congress, and they considered Uganda as a homeland. Like my second Hebrew teacher in Israel said, before Idi Amin. Okay? And he met with Pope Pius X, who was against the Jewish homeland in Palestine. Again, the Pius is right. The 11th and the 12th were actually philo-Semitic. And the 11th was having, I think it was an American Jesuit writing an encyclical, and a pro-Nazi Jesuit named Lido Chalsky intercepted it. It's supposedly still in the Vatican archives, but it never really got published because then he died and Pius XII took over, who was very philo-Semitic too. People don't realize that. Anyway, Herzl died of a heart attack at age 44. Now, some issues that the Jews had to face. Bible talks about a Messiah. We going to have a Messiah? Resurrection from the dead, Daniel 12:2. We really going to have a resurrection? The Sadducees didn't even believe in the resurrection. The return of the Jews to Zion, along with the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. The Jews had to think about this. So again, the word temple was used for synagogue. We're not trying to go back to Israel and build a new temple. This is our temple. Hebrew as a spoken language. Now, you've got people starting to come back, and they're speaking all kinds of languages. Yiddish and English, wherever they're from. And I guess Israel, or Palestine as they call it back then, was like a Tower of Babel. But Eliezer ben Yehuda. Well, yeah, everyone speaking different languages. An interesting story, my second Hebrew teacher said that they had heard people in Jerusalem, somewhere in Israel, I think Jerusalem, speaking, I think it was a dialect of Romanian that they thought had died out 200 years before.
Wow.
I've been on an airplane and listened to Native Americans speaking their language. In fact, I was a student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. You could hear Yupik spoken, Koyukon, Athabascan Indians, stuff like that. There's some of these languages that you think had died out, haven't died out. But anyway, they're speaking different languages. So this guy, he was born Eliezer Yitzhak Perlman. What it is a lot of people, when they go to Israel, they change their names to Hebraize them. I have classmates that have moved to Israel, and they go by different names now. I can think of two of them right off the bat. Women. It's not just the last name is their husband's, it's that they even change their first name. They Hebraize it, Jewish women. One is there still, another has come back. She married, is it a New Zealander or a Brit? I think an English guy, I think it was. But they go by different names now. And a lot of these people, Golda Meir was not her last name. Originally, she was born in actually Ukraine and then moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But I think it was a different name. Anyway, he lived from January 7th, 1858 to December 16th, 1922. He was from the Russian Empire, which, by the way, Putin is supposedly trying to put back together again. In 1881, he immigrated to Palestine. Now, it was ruled by the Ottoman Empire back then. I know we think, the British were in control of the land. That was after World War I.
Right.
Okay? And there's actually, I'll show you the book here in a minute. It's a really good book in our library called A Peace to End All Peace. And it talks about how the modern, it's a very long book, but it talks about how the modern Middle East was built. You know, after the Second World War, of course, a couple of the victors, the United States and Russia, basically carved up Europe. Well, after the First World War, a couple of the victors, France and England, carved up the Middle East, with no thought as to, you know, here's a religious group here, here's another religious group there, you know, two main sects of Islam, you know, Shia and Sunni, and just, they used European standards to carve up the Middle East, therefore forming a peace to end all peace. Very good book. But the key in resurrecting Hebrew as a spoken language in a country of middle languages, of many languages such as Yiddish, he was key in that. He wrote a dictionary. I mean, they had to come up with new words. What do you do for all these inventions that didn't exist? And, you know, I mean, you got biblical Hebrew, rabbinic or Mishnaic Hebrew, and you got some forms of, you know, medieval Hebrew and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, I mean, most people are just using it for prayer and reading and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, people are really starting to speak it and use it. And, you know, what do you do with all these new inventions? It's interesting, for example. Well, the idea was, let's not use cognates. You know, cognate is something you bring in from another language.
Right.
If you ever study French, like you get to a certain level where everything's just like ours, it's just more accent marks. The Hebrew word for telephone is now telephone. It was a word meaning long distance, or conversation from a distance. You know, they were trying that, and modern Hebrew, especially, you know, in the last few decades, has really gotten into cognates. But even modern Hebrew has, since I was there, they've had to come up with, you know, these computer terms. I mean, they're new to us. They're new in English. And they have had to come up with terms. The word for hand grenade is rimon, same as pomegranate. If you ever look at a pomegranate, they sell them at Walmart. They look like, now not potato masher hand grenades like World War II, but, you know, the pineapple grenades. Yeah, so they do that. But he wrote a dictionary. Oh, this is it, A Peace to End All Peace. Get it from our library, David Franken. It is excellent. And it's not some emotional, you know, I'm trying to take sides type of thing. Just here's what happened, and here's why there's not going to be peace. At least in his opinion. 1904, the World Zionist Congress declared the intention to have a Jewish state in Israel. Now things are getting a little more heated. The Balfour Declaration, Lloyd George later became Prime Minister of England. He was a munitions minister. He needed acetone. So he got it in synthetic form from Chaim Weizmann, who helped the British war effort. Chaim Weizmann, by the way, eventually became first president of Israel, not prime minister. Prime minister has the power, president's a figurehead. But if you recognize the name, he did eventually become the first president. Remember, Israelis, especially back then, they're from all these different countries. Who knows how many of them were actually born there? You know, what percentage? And in 1917, the British needed the USA to go to World War I, and the USA had some pro-Zionist people. By the way, when it comes to the formation of Israel and stuff, an interesting one is The Secret War Against the Jews by Loftus and Aaron. Yeah, I mean, there was blackmail involved, getting enough UN votes. And these Jewish authors admit it. There's all that anywhere. You have a deal. Israelis are an interesting breed because they'll do something that no one else admits to, and they admit it. Yeah, we did it. We torture prisoners. Well, oh, wait a minute. It must have been mistranslated. I mean, you ever hear that? You ever pick up on the news these things? There was an operation where they were smuggling Jews out of some country, and there was an area where there were divers and stuff. People would go there to vacation and dive, and someone figured it out. And they just mentioned on the YouTube video, yeah, and the guy figured it out, and he died, diving's dangerous or something like that. In other words, Mossad probably killed him. But Israelis are weird because it's like they do these things and admit it. Yeah, we did that. They're the most honest people on the face of the earth. And they're not the most pacifist, put it that way. But anyway, so the Balfour Declaration was declared in 1917. Lord Balfour was the Foreign Secretary of England. There was an official British policy to support a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. In Palestine, in quotes, is on the final draft due to anti-Zionist Jews. Now, the creation of the modern Middle East. The Ottoman Turkish Empire started in 1453. Transjordan, what we now call Jordan, basically, was closed to the Jews. Arab nations being established. This is after World War I. Syria, 1920. 1921 was Iraq. 1922 was Jordan. Or people will say, well, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, the Transjordan. They always try to, show that. I don't know what they're trying to do by that. 1932, Saudi Arabia. By the way, Arabia in the Bible probably went up as far north as Damascus and Syria. When Paul talks about being in Arabia for 14 years, it doesn't necessarily mean Saudi Arabia. That's modern Arabia. It was a region. Like Asia is not China and Japan in the Bible, it's Asia Minor, what's now Turkey.
Right.
But the House of Saud was given, that place basically. 1943, Lebanon was created just 5 years before Israel, which was 1948. The Treaty of Lausanne. Israel received prospective rights entitled to Judea and Samaria, the West Bank is what they call it, when the League of Nations approved the mandate for Palestine in July of 1922. The Treaty of July 24th, 1923, in that treaty, Turkey relinquished all claims to sovereignty. So only Israel has had legal claim to the West Bank and all Jerusalem since 1923. Britain started backing off. They said, hey, you can have a homeland in Palestine there, for the Jews, but who had the oil?
The Arabs.
They were switching their navy. This he gets into in that book, Fromkin's book. The British Navy under Churchill, they're saying, wait a minute, we're going to switch now from to oil. From, I think it was coal to oil. As the Navy's being modernized. All of a sudden, oil became really important. To this day, we're a petroleum-based economy. Anything made out of plastic, guess where that comes from?
Oil.
It's an oil, yeah. The Arabs start protesting. The Arabs had oil. And there was anti-Semitism in Parliament and the British military. By the way, who discovered the double helical structure, the DNA? Who can tell me? Biology class, remember?
Looking it up.
It's back in the 50s, wasn't it? I don't remember their names, but
Watson and Crick
okay.
took the credit for it. Who really discovered it? Rosalind Franklin, a British, Jewish physical chemist. She had a PhD in chemistry.
She had two
They didn't
strikes
like
against-
Jews in England back then.
She had 2 strikes against her. She was a woman and she was a Jew.
She was a woman and she was a Jew in England back then. So DNA, the double helix, James Watson's, the double helix has some lies in it. And people who knew Franklin started speaking up after that was published, including Anne Sire, or Sarah, however she pronounces her name, wrote a book called Rosalind Franklin and DNA. There were others. Watson and Crick, and I think maybe Maurice Wilkins also might have received Nobel Prizes for it. And they realized she was the one who figured it out, because she did X-ray crystallography. Now when you do that, you get this thing called a goniometer, and it gives off X-rays. It might have been one of the reasons she died. She died of ovarian cancer at age 37. But they don't give the Nobel Prize posthumously, so she couldn't get it. She was already dead. Okay? Britain is was very, anti-Semitic. So was the U.S. World War II, we had an anti-Semitic State Department. My parents tell me what it's like, World War II, what it was like just walking down the streets as a Jew. Especially my mother. I've mentioned stories like that.
We did the SS St. Louis.
Yeah, that's an example.
What?
The SS St. Louis, they were coming from Eastern Europe, right? They were getting out
Yeah.
while Hitler was giving Jews, he was letting them leave. And they left, sought passage. They wanted to get rights to go into England. England turned them away. Churchill turned them away. They came to America. We turned them away. We sent them back to Eastern Europe, and I think like there was like what 900 people, and like 200 or so died in concentration camps.
They were trying to get into Cuba, and what they did was Hitler sent agents in advance to convince the Cubans not to let them off and think it was Havana. What it was a big propaganda thing. Hitler could then say, see, nobody wants these people. And it was planned, it was staged. Of course, Roosevelt was no friend of the Jews.
No, he was not.
And but there were 100,000 Jews there before 1917. This is what they call Palestine. Another 115,000 immigrated in 1919 to 1929. Now 1929 to 1939 was the rise of Hitler, so 250,000 more Jews immigrated to Israel. So 500,000 Jews were in the land by the time that World War II broke out in 1939. By the way, that's not an accurate statement because it did not break out in 1939.
Right.
That's when September 1st, 1939, Hitler invades Poland. That's the start of the war.
No.
How did we get involved? Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had invaded, China, Manchuria. That goes back before that. But anyway,
If you
that's...
wanted to, you could say World War II started with Kristallnacht, right? In Germany, when they
it
started
started
going
with
in and...
Japan invaded Manchuria in 1930 or 1.
1939 and then
I was talking about
1937.
Manchuria got invaded in the early 30s.
I was talking
Yeah.
about the European theater, though. I mean...
Well,
But see,
started
we
when
got in because of the Japanese, not the
Right.
Germans.
No, it started when he rolled into Austria and Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia or whatever. Just took it over.
Well, Austria, they voted him in, 90%.
Right, but then he rolled in on, was it Czechoslovakia or Yugoslavia, one of those countries, and took up a
Czechoslovakia, the
section.
Sudan or something.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
took up a section, just acquired it.
yeah, it's
with
just what
force.
Putin's doing. The
Yeah.
Sudan land, a bunch of Germans there, it's ours. Putin's doing the same thing. A bunch of Russians in Ukraine, it's ours. See, what you're seeing right now is just what Hitler did. And you're seeing the same response. Everyone's complaining and no one's doing anything.
Right.
Okay? Same thing. World War II in my lifetime. 1929, Arab riots and massacres of Jews began and lasted for many years. One account I read was that when the Arabs, there were Jews that were already living peacefully among the Arabs, but when the Arabs attacked, they didn't differentiate, oh, you're for our friends, you're not. They just attacked everybody. Now compare this to the Watts riots, where they still were thinking, wait a minute, it seems like they targeted certain stores that have been ripping off the black community more. And they could argue that one way or the other, but this was just, the Arabs just went against all the Jews, even the ones that had been living there. Peel Commission in 1937, this is in England, or Britain as they keep calling it, partition suggested for the first times. The Arabs rejected it. Now the British white paper, now the British are going back on their word. Yeah, I mean the Arabs have oil. 1939 restricted Jewish immigration to 12,000 per year, and that's as World War II is starting. There was illegal Jewish immigration through the British blockade. There was Jewish resistance in the Jewish agency. Ben Gurion was the head. By the way, it's called the Sochnut, and I remember when I was there, you hear about the iron beds the Sochnut would give you. I mean, they do all kinds of things. Jewish agency, the Sochnut. Pre-state paramilitary groups. Now, the Haganah, which is Hebrew for defense, it was an underground military. And interestingly, when these other groups came out, they sometimes joined the British trying to track down the other groups. I mean, they were anti-British, but sometimes they were to kind of join the British. Irgun, which is short for Irgun Tzvai Leumi, National Military Organization. Okay, it's the acronym is Etzel. Again, modern Hebrew loves acronyms. Now, it might not seem to be an acronym, how does the I become an E, but that's Hebrew phonetics. It split away from the Haganah in 1929. Menachem Begin wrote The Revolt, which is a fantastic book to read. Very, maybe one-sided, it's his view, including the Altalena affair when they sunk a ship in Tel Aviv harbor, as they were bringing arms into Israel, and there was practically Jewish civil war. Very famous event, photographed by that time. They had cameras, and everything. But he was the head, and it's really interesting. he's mentioned, and I've mentioned this, they were just people that they hide in their house. He could hide underneath when the British were coming looking for him, and his dog Roxy would take the roof off. His dog Roxy hated the British. But the rumor was that they were like the Maccabees. They were going out in the mountains, the Judean hills, and in conducting their attacks from there. He says, we weren't. We just living at home and stuff like that. So that's why in the first presentation I brought that up. Now, one split isn't enough. 1940, Lehi. By the way, Lehi is jaw or jawbone. Ramat Lehi, Samson killed 1,000 people with the jawbone. Okay.
Yeah.
Lehi, Ramat Lehi, hill of or high place of Lehi. Lehi, Lochmei Chayot Yisrael, Israel's freedom fighters. Basically, fighters for the freedom of Israel. It kind of goes backwards according to the way we set things up, our syntax. There's an Irgun splinter organization. In other words, the Irgun split away from the Haganah, and Lehi split away from the Irgun. It was something, I'd love to know the details. Sometimes you just see a paragraph in a book or something. But Lehi was very extremist and anti-British. Now, the British are fighting the Germans, and the Israelis obviously don't like the Germans wiping them out in the Holocaust, and they don't like the British who are in control of their land. Whom do you hate more? Begin was very anti-German and was against German reparations after World War II.
Menachem Begin?
Yeah, Menachem Begin.
Okay.
Very anti-German. But he was from the Irgun. The Lehi was extremely anti-British, and at one point apparently got together with the Germans to try to get some, in other words, to sort of ransom out some Jews out of Germany, something like that. And so Lehi kind of came under fire, wait, you're cooperating with the Germans. But the idea was, well, Hitler originally was just trying to expel Jews anyway, he wasn't even trying to kill them. But the Wehrmacht did so well, it's like they're taking over territories faster than they kick out the Jews, and then they decided it's time to kill them off. In 1946, the Irgun blew up the King David Hotel, British military headquarters. This is in Jerusalem. This was photographed. Now, according to the revolt by Menachem Begin, they said, we're going to blow this place up. They brought in bombs in like milk containers, and at least one Israeli was killed in a shootout in the basement or something like that. I've read this a long time ago. I'm trying to remember it. And Begin says they found one guy, a British guy, at the door with his medals. In other words, he was trying to leave the building, and maybe the British guards wouldn't let him leave. Like, we're not going to give in to these terrorists. But in any case, they did blow it up. In 1947, there was a breakout of the Akko prison. 1947, they hung 2 British officers. I mean, there's a big story to each of these. And the British are just getting sick of being there. The UN partition plan, the Jews get some, but not a whole lot. The Arabs get some. It was tough to secure. The Arabs were against it. November 29, 1947, the UN voted. 33 yes, 13 no, 11 abstained, including England. Here's the UN partition plan. The Arab state would be in yellow, the Jewish state not in a whole lot. I don't even think completely contiguous would be in orange. But at least the Jews said, well, it's, some's better than nothing. The Arabs have always been all or nothing type of thing. No, we will not give in at all. So the plan was to be carried out May 15, 1948. The Jews accepted it. The Arabs rejected it and started rioting the next day. The British pulled out. 2 pulled out. I should erase the 2. 100 pulled out, 100,000 troops. 1,000 Jews were murdered and their battles got going. May 14, 1948, the British lowered the flag. Israel raised the flag. Ben Gurion read the Declaration of Independence, and then there was a 13-month war of independence from 1948 to 1949 as Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon invaded. The Bible says, I will plant them upon their land, and they shall no more be pulled up out of their land, which I gave to them, saith the Lord thy God, in Amos 9:15. Any questions? Comments?
I had one more. No, never
I
mind.
have a question.
Okay.
Coming back to the beginning of what you were talking about, when you were talking about there were aspects that were like socialist and communist. I'm curious, how much do they rely on the writings of Marx? Do they look to other writers for socialist and communist ideology? And
I think they all look to Marx.
They all look to
And
Marx.
I know in Israel, when you hear this, okay, again, acronyms.
Mm-hmm.
Mapam is a communist political party in Israel.
Okay.
Mapai is socialist. You'll also hear Labor Party. Originally, Israel started out politically, the Labor Party having a lot of influence. And I think they both look to Marx. It's just socialism is just not as extreme.
Right.
You know, you look at Sweden today, Canada, a lot of countries. It's somewhat on Marxist principles, but it's not the extreme.
Not like Russia.
Not like the Soviet Union or like China.
I was just curious
But-
about that.
Anything else?
Okay, I'll go ahead and ask you. Just, I know what the answer is, kind of, pretty much, but I just want to hear what you got to say about it. The Bible says that the Gentiles are grafted into the tree. Right?
Okay.
Wild branches grafted in. Does that mean we're Jewish?
No, because the Bible talks about Jews, Gentiles, and the Church of God. No.
Okay.
There are some, no. Because you look at what Peter went through, arise Peter, slay and eat. Okay? Jewish law said you couldn't eat unclean animals. And voice from heaven, what God hath cleansed, call not thou common. It is a different religion. Judaism and Christianity are different religions. And the book of Hebrew makes that distinctly clear. Because they are two covenants. Because you had Jews that have been coming to Christian services that were not necessarily all born again yet. And some of them under persecution were thinking of going back to Judaism. And the book of Hebrews says, look, this is a different covenant. Here's what's better about it. So, no, I mean, there are...
Isn't Christianity just the completion of biblical Judaism?
I look at it this way. You look about, okay, the law is a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ.
Right.
Okay, now, two viewpoints. One is that the schoolmaster was a Roman slave who would bring the kid to school and maybe help him with his homework later. Another is that he's the actual teacher. Either way. What the Bible's saying is the law treated you like kids. Most people don't catch this. I work in a prison. I do. And we're now being treated like adults. Okay? It's an adult relationship we have with God, not a child's relationship that we have with God, ultimately. In other words, now you think about it. In our prisons today, in the United States, we treat our adults like kids. Recidivism rate is about 95% get out of prison like I work at. Recidivism rate is about 41%, something like that. In California, many decades ago, they trained prisoners in, I think it was skin diving or something. 90% got jobs related to that. 8% recidivism rate. You look at Norway, you look at Finland, you look at, I think, Denmark. You look at these, Germany, you look at these other countries, they treat the prisoners like adults. They teach them how to survive in society. Very low recidivism, which happened in California, so it can happen in America. I taught in Christian school. Okay? Here's what we do. We treat the kids like adults. That's why discipline's broken down in Christian schools. Mm-hmm. And actually public schools too. It's terrible. In Christian schools, I've taught in them. It's terrible. And we treat the adults, sometimes the teachers, like kids. And this is also in the public school. Again, you look at that article in the Washington Post, I'd love to teach, but, and it starts out with a teacher being called into an office about students' grades, and it feels like he's being treated like basically, he doesn't say it, but it's like a kid. It's like in trouble. What's this email? Come to my office, and we get everything. I get a whole sermon on that I carry in case I ever have to preach, including at my own church. But okay, Greta Thunberg, a kid, okay, who dresses down a bunch of adults.
Yeah.
I can agree with one sentence she said. I should be back going to school in Sweden. Is it Sweden? Then yeah, Sweden. The thing is, there is that difference, and in society you can see it today. We treat adults like kids, it's a problem. We treat kids like adults, it's a problem. Judaism was based, if you really look at the law of Moses, on fear to a great extent. Pick up sticks on the Sabbath, you're executed. That happened in the wilderness. It was based on fear. And, it's Mount Sinai. People were scared. We don't even want to talk to God. Moses, you do talk to him. Christianity is very different, and we're now being treated like adults. And it's a growth process. And what modern society gets mixed up is when we start treating physical kids like adults and adults like kids. If I ever told you something would happen to me in Christian school as a teacher, you wouldn't believe it. They would listen to a kid, not listen to me. I say a kid's doing this in class, they don't want to hear it. So I get treated like a kid, that kid gets treated like an adult, and then nothing ever gets straightened out. Okay, this is typical in Christian school. Now the classical schools don't seem to do that. They believe in behavior. But then again, their curriculum, spend 8-10 years learning Latin. Why not teach them something they're going to use outside the Vatican, like Spanish?
Right.
Or STEM, which classical schools don't seem to understand. The classical Christian schools. But that's a big problem. They're different covenants. The Jews were treated, in a sense, like kids. And the Bible tells you it was the schoolmaster to bring us to Christ. We are adults, in a sense. We get a different relationship. We're born again. The Jews weren't. Now, Reformed theology says they were, but they were absolutely not. You look at John. Jesus is saying, the Holy Spirit hasn't come yet. When I go up, the Holy Spirit will come. They weren't indwelt, none of them. The new birth didn't exist until after the resurrection, despite what Jesus told Nicodemus. It didn't exist yet. We have a different relationship. It is in some ways a fulfillment of Judaism. You get all kinds of typology. God works the same way in a sense, but there were types. There were types, and now there were antitypes. And in the New Testament especially, you get Old Testament types. Behold, in the New Testament antitypes, behold the Lamb of God that taketh away the sins of the world. That's one of them. Even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Get out the old leaven. That has to do with bidikat chametz, when you actually take out the leaven out of your house in a ceremonial way before Passover starts. There's all kinds of stuff like that. Plus, and I mentioned, you got New Testament types fulfillment, the New Testament, Old Testament types fulfillment. The Old Testament, there's a lot of repeating patterns. But it is not the same religion. When I became a Christian, I left Judaism as a religion. Now, I didn't leave my ethnicity. Ask any white supremacist.
Right.
Ask any white, yeah. But they don't even like Jews converting sometimes, because now you can't figure out who the Jews are. You're going to hate these people. They got the wrong genetics. You can't lose that by conversion. But it is different, and I'm seeing more and more that our, bad society, a messed up society is one that treats adults like kids and kids like adults. Mm-hmm. And there are different covenants based on different things. The Christians are not Jews. The Bible never says New Israel. When you read early Romans, 1 and 2 and 3, and it's like you get spiritual. There's a spiritual Israel and there's a physical Israel, and they're not the same. You conflate them, you end up with where Reformed theology conflates a lot. That's a problem. They really do. They'll take different things. They're terrible exegetes, and they keep conflating things. The church goes back to the garden. No, Jesus says, I will build my church. There was no church before Jesus. And, they'll say, the Old Testament saints were born again. Of course, they take a Gnostic approach. You can't do anything at all unless God's indwelling you. No, that's not true. It's, I mean, I'd see these arguments on Facebook, and I don't argue with people anymore, but that was when Augustine brought in Gnosticism, Manichaean Gnosticism, into the church. That's when all that came about. But no, the Christians are not Jews. They might say we're spiritual Jews. I just, smile. I'm not going to start the argument.
Okay. If you have two men standing at the Western Wall.
Yeah.
One's an Orthodox Jew, one of these ones with a big hat and everything. And beside him is a spirit-filled, baptized in the Holy Spirit, spirit-filled Christian standing there beside him. Who has more spiritual authority at the Western Wall?
Ooh.
Authority in what area? Well, the Christian, because we're born again.
So, yeah.
Okay? The Christian's the one born again.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't, as Christians, embrace Judaism to the extent. I mean, we shouldn't think of ourselves as being grafted in. I mean, how? Because
Yeah, but grafted in what way? That's what you got to look at.
okay,
Okay? You can eat pork. The Jews couldn't.
right, that's true.
So I mean, how far does it go? In certain ways, there were certain things God gave spiritually to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and his descendants. And when you get into Galatians and stuff, it gets into that.
Right.
But it's not everything. Read Acts also. Read
Right.
Hebrews. There are some things, but not everything. That was the thing. You don't have to get circumcised if you're a male and become a Jew to become a Christian. And there was an early church belief, not church belief, it infiltrated the church, that you do. And those people hounded Paul everywhere.
Until they cast it out in Acts 15 at the Council of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Paul, I mean, he had to go from, they'd chase him out of city after city. That there's, the idea was, okay, if they're going to be Christian, in other words, you got to be a Jew to become a Christian. Okay? And Paul's saying no. And Hebrews says no. But there are certain types of blessings you get a relationship with God because of that grafting in. But it's not everything. It's not everything. Or there would not be, here's the problem in some Messianic congregations, and especially the Hebraic roots movement. Now they get into that. You have to keep the law. So wait a minute. I have to keep the law? And my Gentile neighbor doesn't? We've got the same Holy Spirit. Something's wrong.
Yeah.
And, that's one of the things when it comes to law keeping and stuff like that. The other thing, which I'll bring up in the last presentation, is how do we deal with the Palestinians? We are Christians. You treat them with respect, because someday you might be preaching to them. Period.
Yeah.
Nothing else stands the test of the New Testament, and that's what we're under. I told my pastor this past Sunday. He pulls out his cell phone, shows me some guy that I guess he had to deal with terrorists. He had just come back after killing somebody, killing a terrorist, and even this guy that has to deal with a terrorist, he says, treat them like humans. In other words, the Arabs, treat the Arabs like humans. Most of them are not born terrorists. They're just trying to conduct their lives under very difficult circumstances. But you treat them with respect. That's how we treat the prisoners. That's how we're supposed to treat the prisoners. I do, so the prisoners like me. I treat them with respect. And if you treat them with disrespect, you put a target on your back. Mm-hmm. Okay? I could give you names and incidences of what happens when you don't.
Wow.
But when we have violence in the prison against an officer, usually, the first question is, okay, I'll say, I don't usually talk like that. What did you do to piss him off? That's what it is. If it's against a woman officer, instincts kick in, you protect her. If it's against a man, what'd you do? He's not going to attack you for no reason. Okay? You're supposed to treat him with respect. Because of the gangs and everything, they will retaliate if you don't. I treat them with respect more than most. And for that reason, it's like, you get into a pot. Oh, we're glad you're our CO. That means correctional officer. Even though I'm a counselor that just does some security shifts, because I treat them with so much respect. That's how you got to treat the Palestinians. Nothing else makes New Testament sense. It might be a minority opinion, but I've heard it enough times from others now since I came up with it to realize that that's the truth. You start saying they need to get out of the land and you got no use of the Palestinians. If you're a Christian and saying that, baby, you've got to learn a lesson in life. Maybe you get thrown out of your own land by other people and told you don't. This will be like the Indians coming back and taking over our land and kicking us out.
Right.
Those Palestinians had been there for generations, and the narrative is, you know, it was a land without a people for a people without a land. Well, there were people there. That's not even true. I've heard Christian Zionists came up with that one. There were people, there were more. A lot of Arabs came in because the British and then the Israelis made it a very good place to work. And yes, to this day, Arabs in Israel, are much better treated than they would be in other Arab countries, and they don't want to be under Arab rule. But there's still a whole lot that get thrown off their land. And there's a lot of ways the Israelis do it. Like if you don't cultivate the land, we take it from you. So they build a fence. Here's what I read. Build a fence. You can't get to your own land to cultivate. Oh, you're not cultivating the land. You can't have it anymore. It matches some of what goes on, like when you read about black history and everything, Jim Crow and all that stuff. Okay, it's on that level.
Wow.
And it gets really, you know, I'll get into that more in the last presentation, but the Israelis do treat them in many ways with respect. You know, if they're going to destroy a house in Gaza, they'll drop leaflets first. You know, we're going to destroy this place, get out. I mean, the Israelis are like saints compared to the way the Arabs treat them in many ways. But still, they get in the West Bank and they can be a bunch of bullies at the same time. They're 18, 19-year-olds. And they're fed a certain narrative, which we're now realizing isn't completely true. Because we got our Freedom of Information Act. They got something like that in Israel. And more information is coming out on how they originally drove out the Arabs in 1949. Stuff that had been kept secret for decades. There's all kinds of stuff coming out now. Israel fighting Russia in 1969. That was kept secret for decades. Now we know, how many planes were shot down, we know all kinds of stuff about it. By the way, it happens in America too. I've talked to American GIs or ex-GIs. You know what you generally hear? Americans don't know what's going on. They don't even know where we're fighting today. I talked to one who'd come back to visit his wife. Well, he was on leave or something. This is in the Obama days. He was in the Air Force. His wife was a Christian school teacher with me. What did he say? Americans got no idea of what's going on there. I talked to another guy who had been in the military in the Vietnam days. We were in places that this day the government, I guess, doesn't admit we were in. Probably Laos and stuff like that. But there's a lot that's kept secret for a generation or two. And what happened there, the Israeli plans on taking over that land, including destroying, driving people out of about 400 Arab villages. Some of the conversations now have been, they're not kept secret anymore. And I'd say, it's a difficult situation. You could say God gave them the land, they didn't take care of God gave the Jews the land, that's why the land's doing so well. You got those arguments. And I think that some of them, in some ways, are valid. As Christians, we can't get too involved with that and start running down people that we're supposed to be winning for Christ. And that's what I hate. That's what I hate. It's like, they're barbarians. I remember a guy who was involved with the military saying the Arabs are barbarians. This had to do with an argument we were having over when some Arab goat herders were, some Americans ran into them, I think it was Afghanistan. That was what was that famous book, like the one guy who survived the attack?
The Lone Survivor.
The Lone Survivor is what I'm thinking of. And how this guy's saying they should have just shot those guys. The goat herds, whatever, the shepherds. And but the thing is, it's as Christians, our primary job is to preach the gospel. And anything that gets in the way of that is wrong. It is a sin. Now, I saw this 40 years ago when the church, when I think when some churches started diversifying their portfolio. It used to be all about preaching the gospel, but now it's getting them saved, baptized, and registered to vote the way we want them to vote. Remember Jerry Falwell? I saw what that mindset did. Here's a guy who's running for office. He's a Christian. Don't vote for him. He's going to take votes away from a conservative guy who's got a chance of winning. This Christian's got no chance of winning. Don't vote for him. Okay? This kind of stuff. That's bad enough. No matter what you think of right-wing versus left-wing politics, our job is to preach the gospel. And when you start running down a group of people, you are now not doing your job. And I understand what's going on in Israel. I've had stones thrown at me 2 or 3 times. And it's much worse now. You know, people are getting stabbed, shot, blown up, etc. And I have contact with Israel when I want it on a weekly basis. Never mind Facebook friends that live there. But our primary job is to preach the gospel, and anything that gets in the way of that is wrong. It's wrong. And it turns out I'm not the only one who thinks that, but I thought I was the only one at one point. It's you got to see that point of view too. Or if you don't like it, just have your home taken from you and be kicked out of your city and told you don't belong here. This land's ours. And then let's talk about it. Okay. By the way, I can lock myself in a pod with 50-odd felons that could easily kill me. They're running around loose. So I do know what it's like to be in a place of danger, even though I've never been in the military. So I understand how the Israelis can feel too. I also know how to treat people. Christian people at the prison know where I stand. I don't preach to them, but they know. They know I'm a pastor. Most of them probably know I'm a doctor. And words come out about my behavior. Like a Muslim who said, "You're so peaceful." Because I go in with a different attitude. And that is our job as Christians. I've got educational goals in Jewish studies that are going to be expensive and time-consuming, and I'm very much into that, Jewish history. But I will not run down the Arabs and say, look, you know, they're worthless, they just sort of leave the land. No, not when they grew up there. You know, but Jesus wants to kick them out. Joshua wants to kick them all out. That's different. That's Old Testament. We happen to be in the New. We're adults now. We're not kids anymore. And yeah, Messiah's probably going to come back, and they're going to get their land back. But our job now is to preach the gospel. That's our primary job. Anything that gets in the way of that is a sin. Period. Anything. Any more questions? Okay, I'll turn this off. And I will have to cut